All right, guys. Why don't we get started? Welcome to another seminar sponsored by Wenkai He Institute. My name is Junyan Jiang, and I'm with the Political Science Department. Today, I'm very happy to introduce to you our speaker, Professor Wenkai He, who is currently Associate Professor of Social Science in the Division of Social Science in Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So Wenkai got his PhD in political science, but I think you're actually a historian. Right? This is a compliment. This is actually a compliment. Who studies state formation in England, Japan, and China from 16th century to 19th century. His first book, Path Toward Modern Fiscal State, England, Japan, and China, is published by Harvard University Press in 2013. In that book, he shows that the key to the creation of a modern fiscal state is really the ability to use centrally collected indirect consumer tax as a way to sort of mobilize long-term financial resources. This is something that happened, as the Wenkai showed, something that happened in England in the 17th and 18th century, in Japan in the 19th century, but did not happen under Qing China. Hence, you see this. One of the reasons you see this great divergence between Qing and the West. In this talk, Wenkai is going to talk about his forthcoming second book, Public Interest and State Legitimation, Early Modern England, Japan, and China, recently published by Cambridge University Press. This is a book that investigates the connections between state capacity, state legitimation, and sort of expansion of political participation in these three countries. I don't want to be a spoiler. I'll let Wenkai talk about this book, but let me just say that if you think about his first book, it has sort of explaining the fiscal side of the Great Divergence, and this one is more on the sort of the political side of it. So Wenkai will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Right? So without further ado, I'll have to give the floor to Wenkai. Okay, great.
Yeah, well, let me start this. I need to share the screen. Yeah. How do I? Yes. Okay. Okay, so thank you, Junyan, for this kind of introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. I know this is a busy time, and we have a keen historian experts on fiscal history, and so this book is actually a kind of political companion to my first book on the fiscal institutions in Qing in comparative studies with England and Japan. So the structure of the book is actually, I'm trying to emphasize there's something called a public interest-based discourse of state legitimations. And this could serve as a common platform for both society and state to collaborate over the provision of the specific public goods important for domestic governance. And I argue there's a similar patterns of such state-society collaborations across so different, like the three early modern states, England, Japan, China, Qing China, which looks so different in surface, but actually have some deeper similarities. And then I'm going to continue to argue that this kind of state-society collaborations yeah. Sorry, I'm not good at this. Could actually provided the dynamic equilibriums for the fiscally weak states to still maintain a relatively good domestic governance, despite of very significant social and economic change over in the three episodes. And then I'm going to emphasize something more on how such a discourse of state legitimacy is actually entail the passive rights on the parts of the subordinates to make them demand through collective petitions and even collective protest and demand the state to fulfill its proclaimed duties. And so this is a story about the political participations in early modern world. And then finally, it's like what kind of, whether this kind of passive rights justified by the state discourses of legitimacies could instigate it, petitions for fundamental political change. So this is the end of the story. So why did I start with, it doesn't work. Yeah, so why did I start with public goods provisions? The reason is like in social science, in the conventional literatures on state formation, I think there's too much emphasizing on the importance of warfares to the state formation. And that is actually, all the expansion of state capacity to extract resources and then develop bureaucracies, everything as a result of fighting foreign wars. I think in this settings, it makes this legitimation part, which is a quite important components of state in various definitions, so difficult to understand. Like, how could the state justify its power to societies when it's only emphasizing on fighting foreign wars? So this is the questions. And then in terms of the domestic governance, the important things is definitely public goods provisions. And so in this case, did the state play any role in these stories? And again, like in the literatures of new institutional political economy and also in the theory of Michael Mann's infrastructural power of the state, they're mostly emphasizing in Western Europe, the public goods provisions was actually a responsibility of self-governed communities. And by having these political rights, they actually get the political concessions from the state. You give me more power to have self-governance, and then I have more consent to contribute tax revenues to you. So this was argued as the origins of representative constitutionalism in Western Europe. And recently in a series of co-evolution of state capacities and assertive civil societies, by Acemoglu and Robinson, they again emphasizing like if the participation by local gentry or local elites, even the local elites coming from the middling sort of the people like yeoman or merchant in running local governance, providing public goods related to the domestic community's needs, and then they would be confident to demand the state to provide the public goods, and that they were not afraid about the development of state capacities because political power was widely dispersed in societies. They could control the state. So in this competition between the strong state and then assertive civil societies, you see the co-evolutions of both sides. But I think, in all these series, they put much emphasizing on the unit of self-governance of communities. I think something is missing because there's a lot of public goods which the scale is larger than the small locally self-governed communities could handle. And then in that case, what are you going to do? The second case is like, we often see conflicts of interest in public goods provisions, especially in large-scale public goods provisions and across regions. And then how are these conflicts of interest are resolved? You need higher political authorities as arbitrators. But this kind of fairness in these arbitrations by the higher political authorities has to be accepted by the social actors in these disputes. So this is the cutting points that I think we can bring legitimacies back into the story of public goods provisions. And what I'm trying to argue that here is like, the state has some discourse of its legitimacies by proclaiming its duty to safeguard the public interest or public welfare of all the subject under its authorities. And in this case, extraction and mobilization of resources could be justified to the people's like I'm contributing to some extent to the public goods provisions at regional and even at national level. And this could be normatively accepted by the social connection people. But in the meantime, I'm not trying to focus on the discourse per se. I'm trying to see how this discourse has actually embodied in the specific provision of public goods in domestic governance, such as famine relief or infrastructure facilities and adjudication of the conflicts of interest across regions, across different sectors. And in this case, it's important is like in this discourse of state legitimacy is this concept of organic version of public interest, which consists of like the specific welfare of different regions and different social segments and even individuals could be part of this organic version of public interest. So by connecting state discourse of legitimacy with its state performance in the delivering of the specific public goods, and I will see a lot of interactions between the state and societies over the connections between the specific welfare and then the general discourse of the state. The important thing here is like different from the source of legitimacy or the symbol or ideology of legitimacy that the state actors could control and manipulate. This performance-based legitimacy has to be embodied in specific public goods provisions that social actors could evaluate by themselves, independent of the state. I'm starving. This is like means you have a bad performance in providing famine relief. My land is in flood. This is performance I can tell. So this would be a kind of interactions between social actors and state actors over the same platform, over the public goods provisions, not dictated and completely manipulated by the state. And the cases I'm investigating in this book is mostly what we call the early modern state for two reasons. Why is early modern state is early? Because it has a quite weak fiscal capacities. It has not established the centralized institutions in public finance yet. So the question is like, how could such a fiscally weak state still maintain good governance and provide public goods provisions? So this is the question. And the early modern state is also modern in terms of the state has been conceived as the impersonal governing apparatus, the whole structures of government, including all the officials, state agent, and then different from the king or the emperor as a natural person. So this is very famous thesis of the king's two bodies, the public features and the private person. But public features actually is connected to the legitimation of this impersonal governing apparatus. And that is also connected to the protection of this public welfare or the public interests of all the subject within the territory of a sovereign. So the public figures of kingship or emperorship actually conveys a very strong normative implications of political duties, not just individual virtues of the king of the emperor themselves. So this is the intellectual theoretical framework here. And then the three cases are, Tudor and Stuart England and the Tokugawa Japan and Qing China, because I argue that they all share this very strong connections between the discourse of public interest-based discourse of state legitimacy and the state performance in providing concrete public goods for domestic governance. And for these three cases, obviously the sources of state legitimacies are quite different. And in England, this is mostly in the framework of Christian humanisms and protecting of the public interest and public welfare as a very important means to legitimate state power when they separate from the Rome. And the terms such as commonwealth, public well, and the good of the public appear frequently in the policy discussions among the royal government and also between the royal government and its agents, unpaid officials in localities back and forth. So this is starting year of the 1533, the breach of with Rome. And then talk of Japan starts with 1640. This is a time that starts with more than 250 years of domestic peace. And this is a very rare case of state formation without fighting any foreign wars. And then the ideology of this benevolent rulership proclaimed by both the shogunates and also the daimyos after this time. And this, I'm going to argue that this is actually a public interest at different levels. It could be public interest at the level of domain, and could be the public interest at the level of the whole Japan. And then after the mid-18th century, Tokugawa Japan looks like the very quasi-federal system. The shogunate has higher authorities over daimyos who have very high degrees of autonomy in governing their own domains. But then the shoguns has higher authority to mobilize resources for larger scale infrastructure or for national defense. And Qing China, the interesting case is the meaning of heavenly mandate has been completely tied to the protection of material welfare of the subject in the Qing dynasties, and not connected to any versions of celestial virtues of dynasties or the emperor. And this actually celestial virtue of the dynasties has been in decline ever since the Song dynasties that reached to the Qing. It's just almost disappeared. So the meaning of like the all under heavens in both China and Japan has a very strong normative implications. It's like the benevolence of the rulers covers all the subjects, just like heavens covers everything below. So that's the metaphors has a very strong normative meanings. In that sense, I think it's actually quite similar to the commonwealth used in early modern England political discourses. But the benevolence covering everything on the below is actually not easy to implement it. Why? Because in these three cases, we know there was significant development of market economy across these three cases in terms of development of interregional trade, and then the expansion of urban populations, including expansion of popular educations. And that means this will have a lot of new welfare grievances and new welfare problems generated by market. Just think about the urban populations depending on purchasing food from the market. And if there's a cut off of the food supply to the cities, they will be in big trouble. So the meaning of commonwealth and the meaning of benevolent rule actually has to handle all these new welfare grievances, challenges generated by the market. So this is a dynamic part of this discourse of state legitimation. And the rise of the political consciousness of commoners is mostly a result of the rising development of mass educations, rise of literacy rates. Why this is important? Because like when people got literate, at least they learn all these phrases of state legitimacies proclaimed by laws, by ideology, by education, and then they learn how to use these key terms and discourses to come back to the state to make claims. Across three, but in the meantime, all the three cases actually have quite serious institutional defects in public finance. And both early modern England and Tokugawa Japan has a highly decentralized fiscal system. This is particularly the case in England. It's like a lot of they don't call tax. The royal government didn't tax the whole realm regularly at the time. A lot of what they call writs are locally assessed, locally collected, and only used for local purpose. And Japan is like, the fiscal decentralization is like the shogunate as a higher political authority over Japan, but only taxed its own territory, which was like 1/3 of the whole Japan. And in this case, like, how can you, with this very limited base of tax base, and how can you really fulfill the duties of providing the public goods across the whole country? And the Qing China's problem is opposite. It has a highly centrally managed fiscal system, and even the provincial government did not have its independent budget at the time. And also, this is a very rigid system. It's like any official spendings over 500 taels of silver. This is maybe equivalent to the 10,000 US dollar in today's has to be approved by the center, and that after spending has to be received by very rigorous, unreasonably rigorous accounting audit by the central government. You can think about this kind of rigid system governs China with such a huge territory and large population. How could such a fiscal system handle a lot of demand for public goods in local societies. This is so each system has its quite serious shortcomings. And so this is why, like, by societies and by the state, they could not really provide this public goods. And then you need to have the kind of collaborations. And so I have two chapters, one on famine relief. This is like public goods to protect the basic welfare of the people. This is like really the basic duties of the sovereigns. And in both England and Togo, Japan, they have highly decentralized granary system, locally financed, locally managed, very flexible. But when you have a larger scale food crisis or even nationwide famines, this kind of decentralized granary system just did not work. People try to preserve food within their own communities, and then that put the urban populations at a huge danger. And in both cases, actually, the royal government and the shogunate has to intervene to make sure the cross-regional transfer of resources of food in the serious time of the food crisis under the name of protecting the larger welfare of the country. So this is, and Qing China has the opposite problem. It has a highly centralized state granary systems called ever-normal granaries, and has a much larger resources to fight with famines by mobilizing resources from different provinces to save one province. But for technical reasons, it is very hard to maintain all these stocks against spoil. It didn't have this modern ventilation technologies. And so in that case, what the Qing state did is opposite from what observing early modern England and Japan. It's like the central government actively invite and encourage local society to participate in building their own community granaries to reduce the burdens on the state. And in the meantime, they actually try to use economic motivations to motivate private grain merchants to ship food to the famine-stricken areas by providing a lot of economic incentives, such as exempting all the taxes on the route. So this is like similar patterns, but different directions. And the same story you can tell in the infrastructures, especially in the hydraulic water control project. England, Japan, yes, much smaller than China, but they are big enough to have this problem of the infrastructure facilities not being able to finance and maintain by local societies. You just think about the major rivers flow through the territories of different domains, and you think about all these major harbors, which when they need a huge money for repair and the drainage, in the case of England, the cities, harbor cities just could not raise the fund for this job, and then the neighboring regions are reluctant to contribute any money for this. And again, we see interventions of the shoganates and the rural government to provide a lot of de facto fiscal measures to help providing this larger scale and nation scale public goods. And China's case, again, separate. It has a centrally managed fiscal system to finance large projects, much better than the case in England and Japan. But it's a system featured with a fixed quotas in both collection and spending, and it was reluctant to incorporate a lot of project of water control into its budget. So small communities could maintain smaller scale public goods like water control project. But how about China is a large country. There's a lot of hydraulic project which is big enough for local communities to handle, but small enough for the state to incorporate in its formal fiscal system. And in this case, we see, these interactions produce the outcome is like the state advance the money to the local societies first. And then local society gets this money and then repair this hydraulic project. And then all the benefited regions return this money back to the state interest-free by paying some extra duties in land taxes. So this is the collaborations to ensure the provision of middle-level scale of public goods. Again, similar patterns, but very different directions. So the important thing here is like, when the state has this discourse of public interest-based legitimations, and it actually means a lot to the people. So on the one hand, you have this duty to protect the welfare of the subject as the loving and loyal ones, but on the other hand, the subject could actually come back to the state as the loving and caring parents to fulfill your duties when you fail to do so in practice. And this is a form of political participations over very specific welfare grievances. So it is very different from what Habermas called the public deliberations in the public sphere. But I think we have to emphasize there is the element of publicness in this kind of narrow welfare-based grievances, because they use the general terms in the state legitimacies to make their particular claims of the state. And in this case, I have to be careful to separate two meanings of rights. A passive right is something like it is derived from the state proclaimed duty to protect public interest or public welfare. And because you have this duty, and I have passive rights to ask you to do this in practice, this is loyal. This is not rejecting your authorities, but this could be very active. I can use collective petitions and collective protests to demand you to fulfill this duty in specific circumstances. And this is very different from the version about the active rights, which was conceived as independent of state duties and state authorities, natural rights or human rights. And that kind of active duties could set constraints on the boundaries of state power. And this is what we know quite well from the political histories, or from from Hobbes to Rousseau to Locke. But the important thing here is that this is intellectual history. This is not the political history of state buildings, state formations in early modern England, and even early modern Western Europe in general, I think. And this passive rights is actually quite common in early modern England, Tokugawa Japan, and China, because they all have similar duties of public interest. So in this case, we did see, again, similar patterns in the social actors' interaction with the state. So individuals' rights to petition, even the procedures jump to the center, was prohibited in law, but tolerated in practice. But individual petitions would not really make much differences, right? But the petitions in the form of assembly or crowd petitions against government policies or against government officials was strictly punished by the three cases. And in the case of England, it's like this is like the treason would be punished by death. The scales are like 40 or more persons. In China, after the 1725, again, for this 40 or 5 people get together and targeted on government for any reasons, regardless whether the petition are justified, the organizers or ringleaders would be punished by death. And Japan is even worse. Like just 4 people would be considered as illegal assemblies. This classroom, this size would be definitely subject to that punishment. But the most interesting is this kind of petition. When you have a conflict of interest across different regions, when you have a conflict interest across different segments, and then both sides try to settle these disputes by looking to the state. By looking to the states, like, both sides proclaim themselves as the loving and loyal subject of the state. So we have conflict, and you have this duty to give us impartial and fair adjudications. And this kind of petitions is not against the state authority, but invite the state authority to provide fair judgment. And they could be very organized, and scale could be huge based on how many common stakers are involved. And this kind of cross-regional and cross-sectoral conflicts of interest to actually extend with the economic, with the industrial and commercial development over time. And that has a lot of potentials for political participations, completely lawful. So in the case of England, this one case here is like the cross-making. If the export market was in the slump, and then the clothiers could not sell, and then they tried to cut the wage of their weavers and even completely stop hiring wage. And all this, the livelihood of the weavers was affected in this case. And then they have these collective petitions to the Privy Councils, like our livelihood, which is part of this organic public interest, was in danger. You have to do something. And the Privy Council reacted by pressure the justice of the peace at the local societies to intervene on the ground of protecting the good of the public. And then we see the very early, industrial relations measures and social welfare measures to help all these unemployed weavers. But this petitions was definitely accepted. And in the case of the Japan, Tokugawa Japan was so brutal to cross petitions. And then we see a conflict of interest. Let's see, the peasant in the Kenai areas, they purchased the fish meals from the market, from the merchant as a fertilizers in their farming. So when the prices of this fish meal goes up, the peasant said, my economic interest, welfare has been damaged. And they organized and coordinated a huge scale collective petitions and asked the shogunate to intervene. Try to see, you have to protect our economic welfare. Another case is again like the peasants who grow this rapeseed. This is mostly used for pressing lighting oils. And then they complain that the prices that the merchant purchased their rapeseed is too low, which affects their welfare. And then they petition the shogunate to intervene. And this kind of scale could be so large, like the thousands and thousands of villagers actually send their representatives and have assemblies to deliberate the draft of petitions, and then they donate money, and then send their representative to Edo to present this to the shogunates, and leaders not punished at all. And in response, the shogunate is actually trying to balance different concerns of welfare and different interests among different groups. It's like peasants, you really care about peasants in the Kenai areas near Osaka, Kyoto, and Kobe. You don't like to have high rises of the fish meals, but is this the high prices of fish meals caused by other regions peasants are purchasing as well, or by the short supplies of these fish meals from the merchant? And merchants' welfare has also to be included. And then for the rapeseed, it's like, I have to make sure, like, if I allow you the freedom to sell the rapeseeds to more merchant, and then you have high prices to sell, how about the price of these lighting oils? Because that is a daily necessities for the urban populations in big cities. So both the interest of the consumers in cities and the interest of the peasants should be balanced. And this balance is again under the large name of the public welfare of the country. Not a single one is the case. China, this kind of conflict is mostly in the use of waters. So this case I give you is like there's one river, the Newton River in Shandong provinces. You don't have to know the details. Like it hasn't been dredged for years, which means like the downstream, there's a lot of silted soils, and the peasants began to grow crops on those soils. And so in 1806, the Grand Canal officials decided to dredge this river to provide it more waters to flow into the Weishan Lake by the Grand Canal to facilitate the navigation of the tribute grains to Beijing to feed the large populations in Beijing. And upon hearing this news, the villagers in this Yutai, which is the downstream of this river, they actually have collective petitions against this proposal, because they said, if you dredge this river, our land, our farming land would be flooded. So you should not do this. And upon in reaction to these collective petitions, the Qing government actually sent officials to do some field surveys to see what is really going on. And then they finally come up with the argument is like, you have to think about the farming interest of the 5 counties in the upstreams, because if you don't really release these excessive waters, their welfare are affected, and also the welfare of people in the Beijing, to depending on this navigation of the tribute grain, are also part of the public welfare. And in this, you just prevail the narrow welfare concern of one county, Yutai, in the downstream river. So you see in all these documents, it's just that the Qing officials trying to persuade the petitioners to give you, a reasonable solutions, and they allow counter petitions if you think these solutions is not reasonable. So this is like quite similar reactions of the state to this kind of, we call the petitions of competitive claims. So this is a, potential. So as long as the larger numbers of people affected, and then they have the common stake, and they could do this organized collective petitions. But there's also a limit. The limit is like, no matter how large the scale and of these protest petitions, it's always on very specific welfare issues. And once these welfare grievances are addressed, it's gone. They never go next step to demand fundamental political change. So that's a limit. So now the question is what if you have many of these kind of welfare based grievances and then petitions? Would they accumulate to the point that demand fundamental change? The answer seems to be no. I take the England as a case to see from the 1660s to 1850s. Actually, the demands justify the active rights was consistently rejected by the English government as a continental radicalism or the Republican radicalism. And even the political demands in the nationwide Chartist petitions was rejected. But the specific welfare grievances in all these petitions receive a very sympathetic ear from the state, like how to improve the factory conditions, how to improve the welfare of the workers. That is like I show you, I have this paternalistic protection of the welfare of my lobbying loyal subject. So the increasing numbers of these welfare-driven petitions would not really lead to the next step of important political change. So this is a limitation. But in this case, could passive rights really instigate petitions for fundamental political reforms? My argument is yes. If there is intangible public goods conceived as a public interest by the population at the time, this is different from domestic welfare, material welfare. So in the case of England, it's like the Church of England was conceived as a public good that the sovereign, the crown, had a duty to protect against both the Catholicism and against the Puritans. And so this is, we see these issues to protect these public goods actually instigated quite mass petitions across regions before the English Civil War. And after the restorations, we see similar mass petitions again, like when James II, who was considered as moving really has a disposition towards the Catholicism, but as a completely legitimate successors to the king. And then there's mass petitions for interfere this, and then by enhancing the authority of the parliament to protect the Church of England as a public good. And in this glorious revolutions, again, we see this protection of reformations in Europe, and then there's a consecutive wars with Catholic countries, huge military spendings, massive debts, massive indirect taxes, but then severe corruptions among officials and among the members of parliament. So in this case, we see there's a conflict between the international dimensions of public interest and domestic welfare dimensions of public interest. And this conflict generated mass petitions after the 1760s. It demanded the fundamental change in parliamentary elections, in the parliamentary system, so the state could better fulfill its duty to protect the public interests of the country. And then the petition the king, the crown, as the father of the people or the common parents of benefactors. Very typical passive rights, not active rights. So this is a case of early modern England. So I stopped here, the year 1780s. And for Japan, a very interesting thing is like the Meiji government in the very beginning actually has two fronts to legitimate this power. One is to recover domestic orders after the hyperinflations caused by the openings. The other is actually to defend the national honor or the national dignities of Japan by reforming unequal treaties. This is what we can take this as an intangible public goods of Japan. But if you fail to reform the unequal treaties by negotiations and diplomacies, and then the ex-samurai elites begin to really push for this fundamental political change, have a parliament, you can show the national wills in negotiating with Western powers. But rich farmers and common people not interested in this because unequal treaties did not affect their economic welfare that much. But when the Meiji government has this, rapid centralizations in the public finance and try to save the value of this paper money by cutting the government spendings, this is a huge reductions in the domestic spendings by the Meiji government. Unbelievable. And most of the burdens of this major infrastructure facilities was on the shoulders of local communities. And these features has been neglected by a lot of studies on the strong state of Meiji. Strong state in terms of the spending on militaries. More than 30% of the government budget was used for the military purposes and not for domestic reasons. So this is another example to see the conflicts about the international aspect of the public interest and domestic welfare demand of public interest, and then generated a demand for the elected parliament in Japan. And China, a case that there's no such intangible public goods. And after the 1870s, the state capacity of Qing government actually raised significantly. But then the meaning of public interest is mostly related to domestic welfare. And on this domestic welfare, the collaborations between the state and the civil society could actually expand. So we see the expansion of the charity organizations organized by the gentry merchants in the Lower Yangtze. They could be so organized and have large resources to provide cross-province famine relief, which is a huge development in terms of the civil societies, but it was welcomed by the state because providing the same services that the state was unable to provide on its own. But when you have a huge repair of the infrastructures, the state has to, again, it is a responsibility of the state. And this collaborations actually means the Qing state was actually quite resilient. If you don't see the war, the defeat by the Japan, you don't see any sign of collapse at the time. So this kind of petitions for fundamental fundamental political reform only came after the two huge indemnities. I take that as a proxies to the international dimensions of public interest. And then you have this conflict with domestic welfare, and then you generated the mass petitions for parliament in before 1911. So this is a negative case. So the story is that we have some continuities in terms of state-society interactions over issues related to domestic welfare. This is continuities across three cases, across time, but there's also discontinuities, or I would call this as a great divergence in political development, which is when you have this conflict over different dimensions of public interest, and then the same passive rights could instigate mass petitions, but for fundamental political change. Without that, you don't see such change. So this is a contextualization in this project. I try to go to each case with similar degree of contextualizations. And then I found these three cases could really talk to each other. And then we found some similar patterns in state-society interactions, which we would not really see before you have this contextualized comparative studies. And also, in this case, we see state capacity has direct form and also indirect form. The indirect form is the state could actually collaborate a lot of resources for the domestic goods provisions without having all the resources coming back to the centers. And that part is mostly neglected in the quantitative study about state capacities. And finally, participations in the early modern world is very similar to contemporary well-governed authoritarian regimes. Both have this organic version of public interest. So, and both would have this passive rights for the subject to demand. But then if we come back to this continuity and discontinuities, it all depends on whether they have dimensions of conflict in the conflicts in dimensions in the conflicts in the diverse dimensions of public interest. And that's is a key point at the end of this book. Thank you very much. I'm a little bit questions and Betty.
So, oh, okay. You're making a very, it's a very expansive thesis that you have here. And I'm wondering, as you go down and look at the details, what you would say, whether, I don't know how to say this, whether it really all fits. So let me just give one example. At the very end, you make this argument about demands for broader parliamentary participation.
Yeah.
And you say that we see it happening, of course, in the British case, which is very famous.
Yeah.
The English case. It happens in the Japanese case, but they already have a diet. I mean, it's not like people are demanding a parliament. The Meiji Restoration has already taken place. Whereas in the Chinese case, you're still at a point where you're looking at China in comparison at a point when there is no concept of popular participation. In fact, even the ways in which officials participate is very, very different from the way that they're participating in these two countries. And one of the ways that I think you're trying to talk about this has to do with rights.
Yeah.
And I found it so I have a question about whether these are comparables, but then the next point I wanted to make is just an anecdote. So I just finished writing a chapter on corporate law. And I was looking back at some of the ways in which Chinese had talked about the need for law. And it's very interesting because somebody like Jiang comes out in his Chuan where he actually is very liberal, in some ways, and says, why do people need a company law? They already have the right to do all these things. And the reason, he doesn't say this, but the reason they have the right to do it is because the state doesn't pay any attention to these things. So it's a little bit different from the kind of argument that you're making. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah. Thanks, Betty. I think for the first question is what I'm. Yeah, for the first questions, I think Meiji Japan have this national diet in 1891. So what I'm trying to focus on is like before 1891, like what are the forces to drive people to demand to have such? So it first came from the basically political elites who considered, it has nothing to do with domestic welfare. They just think about this related to the national dignities of Japan. But then in the case of, when the Meiji government dramatically cut the domestic spendings on most hydraulic project and all the transportations, and then people in different regions are affected by the same policies. So they realize the public finance has to be publicly deliberated. Otherwise, you have this consequence because the state gave priority to military expansion. So this conflict was the quite important driving force for the rising demand from the farmers and merchants, along with the ex-samurai elites, to demand to have this parliament. So it's like it was before that. And in the case of England, it's like they have parliament. You're right, yeah, but they consider that the parliamentary election is too long, like once every 7 years. So this is why you have this so corrupt parliament. So they demanded to have this reforms in parliamentary elections, and even maybe every year elections, as a means to reduce these corruptions by the members of parliament. But then they make this demand to the king as a father of the people to better fulfill. So the petition reads very much like the Chinese petitions writing, the parents like the magistrate, right? So in this sense, I think you're right. The participation by officials and participation by commoners are quite different. So in the famine relief and also in the financing large infrastructure facilities, the negotiations mostly between central and local government, and between the central government and also local elites. This is like really the elite-based petitions. But in the petitions on the prices of fish meal and the prices of the cotton, like all this, and also my land is being flooded, the petitioners are commoners. Like I'm your so humble and loyal subject, but your policy is going to flood all my farming land. You should not do this because I'm part of your subject. My welfare is part of the general welfare. You have duty to protect. So that demand, in both the three cases, if you have the large number of common stakers, the scale could be so big. And then it's this kind of informal political representations going on there. And then they were tolerated by the state. So across these three cases, so what I'm thinking about is like China in the late 19th century did not really have the rapid industrial and urban development as we observed in 18th century England or even in the Meiji Japan. But even if China had such development, and you maybe have more grievances on material welfare, but all these petitions would, just like what you see in England, it would not really escalate it into a demand for fundamental political change. So this is one argument I have. In terms of rights, so how petitioners, have this courage to organize such a large, have a lot of people sign in the petitions and then present to the state, they consider this is my right to do so. Because you have this duty to protect me, but now my livelihood was in danger. You had to do something. And I take this as a very typical expression of passive rights. Yeah, but on the case of, whether they have the rights to do business, to form corporations, and then John Stone's definitions, in my understanding, is like he considered, this is your passive rights. This rights is different from, I have something independent of state authority. I have some rights independent of state laws. That is something fundamentally different. Yeah. So this is why, so I'm mostly focused on political rights, not really on the limited liability, and that's yeah.
I was just talking about it in terms of the way that very, very prominent people were thinking about the issue of rights.
Yeah.
And I think the way that they're thinking about it is anything that the state doesn't prevent you to do.
Yeah.
Go ahead and do it, but you don't need anything formal.
Yeah.
And that's quite different too, I think, in thinking about the role of law and the role of the state in a kind of regulatory capacity.
Yes, so actually, in terms of regulatory authorities and how this is related to the rights, I think this is something I'd like to do more work in future. But it definitely, in terms of political regulations, we see that passive rights is there. You have to provide it impartial arbitration. This is your duty. Yeah.
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is
3 questions.
two questions. Okay. The first one is that, so based on your description, it seems that the states is like an impartial arbitrator of conflict. That's very different from my like understanding of many states, particularly like in the modern early like era, like the states are like controlled or at least influenced by some influential,
Yeah.
powerful. Like, so you didn't mention that, like how they can like disregard those influence to become more impartial.
So should I answer this question first?
May I ask all my questions, then you can select some
Okay.
to answer. Okay. The second one is about the second part of your argument, like link public welfare to like a broader or more political changes.
Yeah.
So so in your argument, you say that so if there are like more abstract and also diverse public welfare like requirement, then there is a higher chance. But if the public welfare is more abstract, it also means that it's harder to mobilize people, or it's harder for me to imagine like how a very abstract public welfare concept that can mobilize like commoners.
Yeah.
So I think I hope to hear more like a micro foundation of how this abstract idea really motivated like the ordinary people. And also there is a balance. So to what extent that the public or the commoners requirement is still within the perception that the state is legitimate, and to what extent they like change in the later area, they're like many people just think this is a legitimate state, we need an entirely new one. So how to balance this?
Yeah, these are good questions. For the first questions, I think what you're describing is the political realities. What I'm talking about this discourse as an impartial, this is a discourse. Like I proclaim I have this image, but even in practice, I'm behaving completely different, right? So, but the point here is like, even for this, in this highly hierarchical early modern world, you just gave this image as, I'm a benevolent ruler, and then people would going to use that to come back to you. So this interaction is something I'm interested in. So in other words, like politics is not just power, and there's some normative aspect even in the early modern time. So this is the first answer to your first question. Secondly is actually, for this intangible public goods, it doesn't mean like it's very abstract. So in the case of the Church of England as a public good at the time, this is actually a message quite clear to a lot of people, because this is like the official ideologies that have been spread and strengthened during the, in the every Sunday and in the it's related to the daily practice of the Church of England. But even so, I think you're right. It's mostly elites are very active in mobilizing this kind of intangible public goods to instigate mass petitions. They are elites. You're right. And also this kind of intangible public goods could be influenced by people with, maybe they have no interactions in their daily life, but they all have this idea, like I'm the member of Church of England. The same answer can go to the issues about the state, Japan's national honor and national dignities, because that has been the image emphasizing by the nativist scholars in Japan in the late 18th century. And the message was actually quite popular to the Japanese at the time, not just to the elites, but to a lot of literate audiences as well. So in this case, it is intangible, but it's not absolutely abstract for ordinary people to have a grip. So in the case of China, is that why Qing state appears as illegitimate to most of the Chinese people, a lot of Chinese people at the time. This is mostly after the Boxer incident. When you have these two huge indemnities, Boxer indemnities and the indemnities to Japan, that means most of the state revenues went to pay indemnities, and that its normal functions in domestic governance completely disappear. And it has to get more revenues for its modernization project, and they actually increase the burdens on the people, but did not deliver any services to the people, even the basic services that it could provide it before 1894. So this is the main reason of the force of the legitimacies. So as long as you're providing a very good performance in domestic welfare, the legitimacies could be quite well secured. Yeah, yes.
Thanks so much for the very excellent talk. I have 3 questions, but most of them are clarification questions. One is by legitimation, you mean the state legitimize their authority or the subordinates to legitimize their petition? And by divergence, I believe Kenneth Pomerantz, for him, the divergence is between China and Japan on the one hand and Britain on the other hand, right? But here, the divergence we are talking about is China on the one hand and Japan and Britain on the other hand. So are we talking about the same divergence? And the final question is, but eventually, although at first we saw that both England and Japan had a demand for electoral parliament, eventually there was a further divergence within this early convergence that eventually is Britain that developed democracy instead of Japan. Then how to explain this further divergence within this convergence? Thank you.
Yeah, let me answer your questions one by one. The first, the issues about legitimacies. I think what the legitimacies, what I'm talking about is the state trying to normatively and morally justify its coercive power to society, to the social actors. Like why you have to accept it my coercive power. So this is the key part in this legitimation, legitimacies. But then all these words, all these key terms that the state used to justify its violence to the people could be used by the people to make their claims on you. So this is the second part. So there are different things, okay? And then the issues about the great divergence, I think in the case of Ken Pomerant's book, he's mostly talking about the great divergence between China and early modern England, especially England after the industrial revolutions. I use divergence here as a metaphor to see there's a, quite obvious differences across cases that originally look similar, but then the outcome is quite obviously different. So in this case, it's like I'm trying to talk about this concept of passive rights. It's the same across these 3 cases. But then the divergence is like in the case of England, in the case of Japan, you see the mass petitions justified by these passive rights, but then demand on some fundamental political change. In the case, you're right. In England, they already had parliament, but they said the parliament election is too corrupt. The parliament election is too long to protect all these corruptions, and they're at the cost of the domestic welfare of the people. So this is a fundamental political change, a demand fundamental political change. And in the case of Japan, it's like it didn't have this parliament, but with all this conflict between the public interest in the domestic dimensions, international dimensions, they said we need to have a parliament to make policies to better protect the welfare of the people, to better fulfill the duties of the emperor to its subject. So the parliament was considered as the best means to show the benevolence of the emperor. Again, passive rights, right? But you're already asking something quite new. And then China, you did not have this demand for this fundamental political change. This is why I call this as a divergence, as a metaphor only, yeah.
Actually have 3 questions. So the first question is, what extent do you think marketization played a role in this story? Because when we're looking at all the stories that you raise about people raising demands to the benevolent ruler, it happened in a marketized condition. Like it happens in a market where you sell things is actually too low or too high. So like as an extension to that question, do you think actually like the development of capitalism, marketization has a role to play in this story? And second question is, I'm wondering whether or not those rightful resistance stories, like, do they help the cause in the long term, in the sense that people accumulate their resistance strategies that can be later on used in other contexts? And do you think that is part of the story? And also I was just thinking, like, in a modern context, like rightful resistance, like, will it actually lead to some sense of difference in the active demands for active rights?
I think for the first questions, it definitely related to, I don't call this as modernizations. It's too abstract. I take the historical process of economic development, urban development, and political development in a historical process. And then this historical process end up with something we call modernization. So I don't want to put modernization back into the historical processes, but you're right. From this commercial development and the economic development, the next stage we call something, oh, this is a capitalist economy, industrialized capitalism. And in industrialized capitalism, we do see this increasing welfare grievances caused by factory systems, are caused by the conflict between the capitalist or the working class, right? But the conflict of the working class and the capitalist could also be cast in this conflict of interest between different segments of societies. And then you could really talk to the state authorities, like, you have to intervene. You are not supposed to be the representative of this capitalist class per se. This is not your public duties you proclaim to us. And this is what Gramsci called the hegemonies, right? The capitalists don't say, oh, this is our interest, this is our class interest. The capitalists as a hegemonic class present their interest as something common to the whole societies. This is one way they connected their interest with the general interest of societies. And then you can grapple with that. But you have to join the game to see, I could be the counter hegemonies. But the essence is similar to what I'm discussing here. This dynamics in proposing your welfare as a part of the general interest could be a process of negotiation and contestation and then renegotiations over time. And this is what we observe is happening in contemporary China, right? Yeah.
I also have a question about, like, for example, some of the rights, like property rights, I think it is normally regarded as a kind of active right, positive rights that of the people. And in your arguments, it seems that people in China, those kind of farmers, arguing about their land laws to do some kind of water hydrates projects down the Qing government. And when they're kind of land lost due to this, and they are persuaded by the state officials to give up their lands, and state might give some kind of compensation to them, and they just stop from here. Stop from just asking more. But it seems like for some, but it seems like it kind of distinctly different for the people or the elites or the farmers in England or Japan. It seems like their kind of property, if kind of damaged by a state, their kind of demands can be different. There's something demands can be like to regard not only to asking the state to ask for compensation, but also to ask the state to really protect in a kind of institutional or promising in the future way. Is it, do you regard it as a really distinctively that China are so kind of circular, focusing on material interests, and people, those kind of elites or farmers asking those kind of rights in England or Japan acting differently, fundamentally?
Yeah, this issue about the private property rights is actually a very tricky but a very important one. The reason here is that the discourse on private property rights, especially in neoliberalism, is different from the private property rights in the historical process. in the historical process, actually, even in case of England, when you drain a large area of land, you definitely affect people's private properties. When you dig a canal and then you have the conflict of interest of different private properties, if each side claims their private property is sacred, and the story would be very different, because that would make like the consensus almost impossible to make. And in both the case of England and Japan, I see a lot of compromise, like compensations offered to make the victims accept it. This for the sake of the larger welfare of the country, of the people. Even in case of England, in case of United States, you have this eminent domain, right? Eminent domains like I can use project for public welfare to prevail over your private property rights. So I think when the private property rights be conceived and proclaimed as active rights, completely independent of the state, this is, in my readings, is very new development. Definitely in the 20th century, associated with the rise of the libertarianism and also the rise of this free market ideology. Yeah, that is very different from the meaning of private property rights before. Yeah, so this is an important issue.
And also, like in your case, in reviewing those kind of archives, how did you really distinguish those kind of cases regarded as they are advocating on the basis of passive rights? Like, for example, when in the reality, they kind of if the protesters wanted the results to be really achieved or protected by the state, is it kind of a strategy for them to phrasing their kind of demands in this way, in the passive rights?
Yeah, that's again a very good questions. The question here is like, whether this is just a strategy to make it more acceptable by the authorities. This is very likely, yeah. But why I interpret this as an expression of passive rights is just by reading all these petition documents. They always start from, your loving parents, loving father. You're a humble but loyal subject. But now I have this economic hardship. But now I have this welfare grievances, and you have duty to protect me from this. This pattern, you can interpret it as a strategy. But in that case, we will have to see how this kind of strategies is connected to the rise of active rights among the subject. This is this will be a different research project. Like how these are connected, not intellectually, but sociologically and historically. Yeah, this is actually a project I'm very much likely to do. Yeah.
Actually, I have a follow-up question based on that. So I was just thinking, most of the subjects at the time are likely illiterate, and so those letters are probably written by Xiu Cai, or the people who I read. So maybe they have like a shared format among them.
Yeah, so you're right. Even though the literacy rates was quite improved for the three cases, but not everyone's literate. You're right. But in terms, and also for the case of England and Japan, like I think to some extent in China, is like the signatures in these mass petitions. I mean, in the petition of Chartist petitions, there's like more than 1 million signatures, a huge sheet, giant petition box. A lot of these petitions was actually signed by one person on behalf of other people. And we see the same phenomenon in the mass petitions in Japan. You see it was signed by one person on behalf of many. So this is why a huge number of signatures in petitions was rejected by the authorities as, this doesn't represent the general will, was the majority's view, because it just, how the signatures was collected this itself is again like very interesting questions, and the same questions for the mass petitions in United States for women's suffrage. And you see, a large number of signatures was actually not done by individually, but they have some representatives. But at least in the case of Japan, England, we see there's informal assemblies to discuss and debate on how to draft these petitions. So even if some of the members are illiterate, but they can hear what they are going to talk about and what they're going to write down. And that is also important, the participations. You don't have to be illiterate, but you understand what is going on in these deliberations. I think similar things goes on with China's villagers in drafting these collective petitions. Even though I'm illiterate, but I know what is going on. But this kind of informal assemblies, informal deliberations has not really been examined systematically. Yeah. Yes. But how do you?
That was
Neither go on.
Ask a question. No. I mean, the most interesting thing I take from your talk is that so it got me thinking about like the role of institutions and what kind of effect it has, right? I mean, the most interesting thing that I take from your talk is that if you look at your three cases, right? I mean, in terms of the overt higher level institutions, they're very different, right? I mean, Britain was a sort of parliamentary democracy, Japan had a diet, but it's more of like an oligarchic arrangement. China's basically an empire, monarchy. But then, if you go down to the level of, looking at the state-society relations and how people think about how they interact with the political authority, there's actually remarkable similarities. I mean, they have more or less a similar kind of concerns and issues. Like, it's all about public goods. When they petition, they use the same kind of rhetoric. It's all about benevolence and paternalism, and also the way these issues got resolved is also very similar, right? So either state intervention or the government partnering up with the society. I mean, in modern like public terms, this would be called like public-private partnership, basically. So there are a lot of contemporary elements there. So I guess my question for you is, if they're so similar, right? And how should we think about the role of institutions? Right? Do they even play a role in shaping state-society relations? Because if you think about a large part of this contemporary social science literature is all about you have different institutions and you have different state-society relations. Autocracy, democracy are different, right? But then it seems that in your case, they don't really matter, right? And also, how should we think about democratization in that context? Do people even play a role in this, right? Or is it just mostly a league game? Another thing I want to ask you, sort of a smaller thing, is you mentioned about this positive rights and the passive, active rights, passive rights, like they're different. They require different political arrangements, right? Is there a trade-off between these two things, right? Because if you think about the sort of early modern world as one where you don't get much of a political accountability, you don't get to remove the people in power, but then you have benevolence, right? You have these arrangements that respect and honor your passive rights, right? And compare that with a situation where sort of you have the rule of the people, or you're the ones who are actually people are the ones who are actually participating and making decisions of a more modern democracy in a sense, right? But someone could argue that in that system you actually don't have much of a protection of your passive rights. You have the positive rights, active rights being guaranteed, and you can call shots. But other groups also have similar rights to you. So it's all about you guys fight it out, right? It has nothing to do with the authority or the president doesn't really have a business in sort of adjudicating these disputes, right? So how should we think about? Is there a trade-off between these two kinds of arrangements? Right? Or is a trade-off necessary? Right, so those are my two questions.
Yeah, these are big questions. First, I think we have to be careful in the use of term state or empire. So I mentioned in my book is like when I talk about China, I'm referred to China proper, which could be called as a state in the Qing Empire. And then this is why I'm only focused on England instead of Britain, which include Ireland, Scotland. That's empire's different story, but state is another story. Even Japan, if you take this Hokkaido, at that time it's called Ezochi, right? It's similar to a kind of colony. So, but you don't see the same discourse of legitimations applied to subjects in colony. So that's a very interesting questions. How the alien people in the colonies in your empire was incorporated into the protection of this discourse, or they were rejected forever. This is a very, very interesting case in terms of the connection between state formation and empire expansion. This is why I'm only emphasizing on the Qing as a state, China proper. And on the case about whether institutions matters in this is really, really good questions. So I think what I'm trying to examine in this case is to see you have a discrepancies between your institutional capacities and your political discourse or political obligations to the people. And within these discrepancies, you need these interactions between society to complement the defects or shortcomings in your formal institutions. So you can take this as a story about informal institutions. And then whether institutions matters, I think it matters a lot. So it has to see how the role played in this informal interactions could be taken over by the state if the state has more development in formal institutions. And that's a story about both England and Japan when they finish this transformation of modern fiscal state, which means the state really have a huge amount of fiscal capacities to handle the issues that they used to have to depend on the collaboration with societies. But by doing so, you also invite criticisms from civil society to see whether you use these revenues, much increased revenues for this purpose or not. So the politics are removed to a new platform when you have the institutional transformations. But before you have these transformations, you see a lot of the informal interactions going on, informal institutions going on. So in that sense, institutions matters, but institutional development also matters. And when you have a new set of institutions, and then it matters in different ways. Yeah, but I agree with you. And what's the last question?
Yeah,
active rights and passive rights. This is whether there's any trade-off and compromise, I'm not sure. This is also a question related to the early questions on whether the passive rights could actually be the means, a hidden means to express active rights, because active rights basically reject and set a constraint on state authorities. This is really confrontational. I don't have an answer to this question. I'd like to do more research on this topic, but in terms of trade-off, my answer might be no, because active rights is really assertive. You don't really want to see the sacrifice of your active rights, which you consider already independent of the state authorities. And then why should I give any concessions to you to get any benefits from you? This is why social movement or social protests instigated by active rights are very confrontational to the state authorities, unless the state was controlled, tamed by protesters. We see a lot of early protests of active rights was over religion. No compromise. Yeah.
All right, looks like we're out of time. So, thank you, Professor, for the great talk.